Welcome to Engage, leading conversations that matter. Join in the conversation. Send an email to engage@cfpublic.org. Send a recorded talkback message on the free Central Florida Public Media app. Leave a voicemail by calling 407-273-2300, extension 246. Engage is made possible with the support of listeners like you.
You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Coming up, a Florida teen's forethought to collect her own evidence proved she was the victim of sexual abuse after investigators treated her as a criminal and charged her for lying. Also, overcoming political differences and taking one small step to bring communities together, one conversation at a time. First, though, this week, State Attorney Andrew Bain announced the 17-year-old arrested in the Halloween night downtown Orlando mass shooting is being charged as an adult. 2 of the 9 people who were shot died, and a woman was hurt when she was trampled by the crowd running for safety. Jalen Edgar faces several charges, including second-degree murder and attempted murder. State Attorney Bain said more charges are pending as the investigation continues, and his office is pursuing first-degree murder. Here's Bain explaining some of the factors that went into his decision to prosecute the 17-year-old suspect as an adult.
This decision was not made lightly, and only after reviewing all the available evidence. This decision is based on several aggravating factors, including the brazen nature of the crime and the multiple victims who were shot in the middle of the street in downtown without simply celebrating Halloween. I have personally reviewed and looked at all the records and videos in this case, and there's no question that this individual should be charged as an adult.
In 2016, Florida direct filed or prosecuted juveniles as adults without a judge's review, more than California, Texas, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Michigan youth combined. Since 2009, more than 16,000 children, some as young as 10 years old, have been prosecuted as adults in Florida. So how are minors, those under the age of 18, charged as adults? How is that decision made, and what are the guidelines for these types of changes and charges? Engage producer Richard Copeland asked those questions of Florida A&M law professor Leroy Parnell. The discussion began with Parnell describing the methods by which a prosecutor can file adult charges against a minor.
There are 3 different ways that a juvenile can be tried as an adult. One of those is a direct file. It's discretionary. If the child is at least 14 and is charged with certain offenses, including murder, manslaughter, sexual battery, and a list of other offenses, the prosecution can make the decision to have that person bypass the juvenile court and be tried as an adult. There are some offenses would only allow a direct filing if the child were at least 16.
Now, there are some offenses that would require the charging.
Yes, there are some mandatory direct files for a child who's 16 or 17 and is charged with murder, armed robbery, sexual battery, and has been previously adjudicated a delinquent. There is a mandatory requirement, direct filing.
So when it comes to the discretionary filing of these charges, what is a prosecutor looking at? What are they taking into consideration as to whether to charge this minor in juvenile court or as an adult?
Well, it is to some extent a subjective decision. The typical factors that would be included, one, obviously the seriousness and the aggravation, the aggravated circumstances of the alleged offense. To some extent, how notorious the case is at that time. In theory, it may be more theory than practice. In theory, the decision should be made to some extent on whether or not they believe the juvenile can be rehabilitated as a juvenile.
And without sounding overly cynical, to some extent, do politics play a role in the calculus?
Oh, I think absolutely. Absolutely does. I mean, the juvenile system is one that engenders a certain amount of societal schizophrenia in the sense that we recognize that we need to have a juvenile court, that children should not be treated as harshly as adults, that children can be rehabilitated, But at the same time, there is a public perception of fear. Now, part of that perception is based on reality, and some of it's not, in terms of what threats juveniles may pose to a community in general. And there is an image that a lot of people and you might say society in general might have that juveniles who commit certain offenses are so violent that they cannot be rehabilitated. So that it would be shocking for a lot of people for such a child to be treated as a child. They would feel that that is unfair and not protecting them from future harm. I don't know if statistically that is supported. In fact, I would suggest statistically it's not supported, but the public perception is there that if we don't take certain children who meet certain profiles off the street, that somehow both unfair and exposing the public to unnecessary danger. So that's a political perception to a large extent, as I said, may not even be rooted in statistical fact, but it's nonetheless there.
Well, building off of that, when we're talking about the trying of a minor as an adult, do those adult sentencing guidelines still apply? What guardrails are there insofar as limits as to how somebody under 18 could be sentenced, even if they are being tried in an adult court?
Well, it may vary depending on the nature of the offense, but a child who's tried and convicted as an adult, as a general matter, is subject to adult penalties. Now, some of those penalties are controlled in terms of minimum ages, certainly at the highest end in terms of capital punishment. There's limitation there. But beyond that, there's not much in terms of actual sentence difference between an adult and a juvenile, if in fact the juvenile has been convicted as an adult. Now, there may be, in terms of discretion in the adult court at the time of sentencing, mitigating factors that the court could take into account in terms of imposing a sentence, and age would certainly be one of those mitigating factors.
Does that mean the death penalty is on the table?
Not necessarily. We have some case law to the effect that individuals who are below a certain age point at the time that the alleged capital offense occurred would not be eligible for the death penalty. A child who commits an offense younger than 16 is probably not eligible for the death penalty.
Life, no parole?
Life, no parole is on the table.
Okay. Other states require prosecutors to obtain written consent from a judge when doing this, when shifting a charge on a minor into an adult court. Florida law gives prosecutors broad discretion in charging minors as adults. The prosecutor's decision isn't subject to any kind of judicial review. It cannot be appealed. Are there any kind of guardrails in Florida, and why are they so stringent in Florida?
Well, first of all, bear in mind that the systems in place for transferring a juvenile to adult court differ from state to state. In Florida, there are three different ways of doing that. So there is the direct file that we've talked about. There's also what's known as judicial waiver. Now, judicial waiver would require some type of hearing before the court to determine if waiver to adult court is permissible and answer questions such as whether or not the juvenile is amenable to rehabilitation. And then the third way it can happen in Florida is if a grand jury decides to indict a juvenile directly. Much of this is a result in Florida in terms of beefing up the direct filing ability, is a direct result of perceived increase in juvenile crime that from the 1980s on, people believe was happening, despite the fact that juvenile crime and serious juvenile crime has declined significantly in the last few years. Prosecutors wanted the power to do this in Florida, and certainly it was raised within the legislature. You can only speculate at this point, but it also implies that to the extent that such decision-making is removed from a judge and a hearing review, it increases a level of certainty as to what the outcome be, and also suggests some level of distrust that juvenile courts would not act in the best interest of protection of the public.
Now, a recent Miami Herald investigation found that, on average, youths tried as adults are sentenced to greater sentences than adults who are tried and convicted on the same charges.
Not surprising.
Why do you say that?
I say that because there are a number of different aspects about trying juveniles as an adults that are troubling. One is there's a racial disparity in terms of who gets transferred to adult court, and that can carry over into not only jury determinations, but court determinations and all the concerns that we've had about mass incarceration. There's also the perception that sentencing authorities have that if someone commits certain offenses at a young age, that they are to some extent less likely to be redeemable than adults who commit similar offenses. The court very often, in terms of sentencing of a juvenile who's been convicted as an adult, has access to a longer history of juvenile offenses. And if a person who's been convicted already has a long history before they were treated as an adult, that tends not to weigh in their favor. So I think that a lot of it can be summarized as the perception and even to some extent the stereotyping that convicted juveniles have in adult court.
And finally, Professor Purnell, you mentioned that you found a lot of things about the juvenile justice system troubling. In what ways would you like to see reform within the state system?
Well, I think that we still need to tackle the basic premise of, do we want a juvenile court or not? And if we do, then to what extent is ever trying a juvenile as an adult consistent with our faith in a juvenile justice system? So in terms of reform, I'd like to see reduction and perhaps even elimination in many categories of juveniles being tried as an adult in order to give the juvenile system a better chance of doing what juvenile court is founded to do. I'd also like to see the very troubling pattern of racial disparity addressed in terms of who gets tried as an adult and how they're treated. And that's a disparity that flows throughout both our adult system and our juvenile system, and even is reflected in our school system when we look at racial breakdowns of children accused of wrongdoing. And if you control for identical offenses and identical records, there is too much opportunity for unfettered discretion. Reviewability is, in my opinion, a significant and a necessary part of any type of fair system of due process. And I think the juvenile justice system, particularly in terms of decisions on whether a child should be treated as an adult, needs to have more reviewability, more openness, and more transparency than it does right now in terms of justifications that are used for making this significant decision.
Leroy Purnell is a professor of law at Florida A&M University College of Law in Orlando. Still ahead here on Engage, we'll meet a young woman whose reporting of a sexual assault to the Polk County Sheriff's Office resulted in charges being filed against her. We'll meet the reporter who exposed the conduct. Just a reminder, we want to hear from you. Let us know what you'd like to hear more about or what you're glad you heard. Send us an email to engage@cfpublic.org. You are listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. You're listening to Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. Ahead on this program, Central Florida Public Media producer Abe Aboraya stops by with the latest installment of One Small Step, the series that pairs people with opposing views together for 90 minutes.
I had a discussion several weeks ago with a very close friend over gun control. But I've known the guy for 20 years, so I'm going to not be friends simply because we don't agree on who should own guns.
We'll meet Julius and Ray, two Central Floridians who disagree on politics but find common ground with music. First, though, Law enforcement agencies encourage children who are survivors of sexual abuse to cooperate with investigations into the crimes perpetrated against them. But what happens when those children themselves are accused of leveling false accusations? That is exactly what happened when 13-year-old Taylor Cadle informed the Polk County Sheriff's Office her guardian was abusing her. The Lakeland resident, you see, was removed from her mother's care at 7 and placed into the foster system. A year and a half later, she was adopted by her great-uncle, Henry Cadle. Soon after that, he started abusing her sexually. This went on for years until a church counselor directed Taylor to the Polk County law enforcement. There, she told her story to a female detective who quickly turned the session into an interrogation. Taylor was accused of making up the allegations, and she was charged with lying to police. A judge sentenced her to probation, where a probation officer forced her to write letters of apology to her great-uncle and the Polk County detective. All this time, Henry Cadle continued to sexually abuse Taylor. Eventually, Taylor gathered enough evidence for investigators to file charges against Henry Cadle that saw him convicted and sentenced to 17 years. Rachel DeLeon is a reporter with the Center for Investigative Reporting, and she uncovered Taylor's story and filed it with PBS's NewsHour. Taylor and Rachel both joined us to parse out the story. The conversation begins with Taylor describing the first time she approached the Polk County Sheriff's Office for help.
The first time that I had reported the sexual assault, I was met with a detective who believed my parents and the labels that they put out for me as to who I was as a person. And she took those answers and she kind of ran with it and sided with my parents. And in the end, determined that I was lying about the things that I had came forward with.
You are reporting a crime to police for the first time, and then you are interrogated.
Yeah, so I was very much interrogated. I feel as though the detective who worked my case did not have proper training to be, one, working with victims, but also children. Like, she had no business in that department whatsoever. I was just honestly begging for somebody to, at the very least, listen to me. But nobody listened. Nobody believed me. I had nobody. There was really nobody in my corner.
You actually ended up in front of a judge facing charges of lying to police.
The judge court-ordered me. I was on probation. I was court-ordered community service hours. And all of this, me coming out with my story the first time was allegedly because I was basically looking for attention, and I did it out of anger. So I was court-ordered probation as well.
After everything that you've endured, after all of this, the abuse continues. What did you feel your options were at this point?
So I didn't really think that I had any options. My options were kind of over once I pled guilty. It was just probation and move on with life, basically. But, moving forward, the second incident, my options were kind of now or never.
Taylor, how did you find the strength within yourself to not give up at that point and keep going?
The fact that I knew that my life was already, excuse my mouth, but hell. Living where I lived was literally like living in hell. And I knew that if I didn't come forward and speak up about it, that I would continue to live there until the age of 18 with the person who had already assaulted me more times than I can count.
And eventually you had to take charge of collecting evidence to build a case against him.
That plan, it was not like a thing that I had thought about for, the year leading up to it when I had moved back. It was a very spur of the moment plan, and it all came to me within 15 minutes after we had stopped at a gas station or at a Dollar General, sorry. It all came to me when we left the Dollar General. I had about 10 to 15 minutes from the time that we left to the time that we stopped for the assault, that I had to come up with a plan, and I had to come up with something pretty fast.
Did you feel a change from law enforcement once you were forced to provide your own evidence?
I wouldn't necessarily say a change, because I wasn't met with the same detectives that I had on the first case. I think just different people in general treat people differently. So I think, given the fact that I had a completely different detective who showed up that night when I had made the phone call the second time, that was the reason that I was treated differently. I was treated with some patience. I was treated with some sort of understanding to the situation.
You're able to tell the story and recount some horrible things. Why are you willing to share your story? What do you hope that people take from your terrible experience and your strength through it?
So there is two things. One would be the fact that I hope that my story reaches another victim who was, regardless of if they were believed, if they came forward or they didn't come forward, and, what have you, just any victim in general who has had similar things happen, regardless of, as I had stated, being believed or not. I would like to reach a victim who could benefit from hearing my story in some way. Or, when I was going through it, I thought that I was alone. I obviously was so little, with not so much of a big understanding of the world, that these things do happen. It's not okay that they happen, but they do unfortunately happen. And I could only wish to one, again, have some impact on another victim. And two would be for the police department to acknowledge the mistakes that were made, and the things that went wrong within my case the first time, and make some sort of change, some sort of protocol that ensures that this does not happen to anybody else.
Rachel, if I could bring you into the conversation, what led you to this story? Take me back.
So I had been looking into cases like Taylor's for a little bit, and I mostly was only finding adult cases. And that has due to the fact that I was looking at media reports, and usually journalists don't have access to juvenile records. So I saw in the Lakeland Ledger in 2019 a story about Henry Cadle's sentencing. And I read that the person who he had victimized had been previously charged with a false report, and then collected her own evidence to prove that she wasn't lying. And I thought it was an extraordinary case, and I really wanted to talk to Taylor, but she was still a child. So I waited to reach out directly to her until Taylor was an adult. So that was last winter. And I wasn't going to do the story unless Taylor said yes. There was no way I was going to do that. So once she said yes, we started collecting records together. She was putting in requests herself and getting, lots and lots of documents to read through, basically. So I did the story because it was extraordinary, and because Taylor wanted to tell the story.
What was the response from the Polk County Sheriff's Office?
There has been no response. I don't know if there will be a response from the Polk County Sheriff's Office. I sent them, numerous emails. I've called the public information officer. I tried to reach Melissa Turnage. And so far, no one has said anything.
This is not an isolated incident. It's something you found in your reporting.
It's not an isolated incident. Unfortunately, I found several others similar to Taylor's, where I was listening to audio or even watching these video recordings where police would turn on them at some point, and the questioning started to sound more like how you might talk to a suspect. So they're doing things like asking repetitive questions. Are you sure you're not hiding something? Well, what if I told you I have this evidence? I found in other cases that police were making up evidence. They would say that somebody took a polygraph test, or the surveillance footage shows X. But in fact, that didn't exist. And if you're dealing with someone who's recently traumatized, or even not recently traumatized, it's not very hard to get someone to question their own memories sometimes. And so that was happening to these women, mostly young women. And then when I heard it happen to Taylor, who was 12 at the time, what you hear in the PBS NewsHour piece is a detective who is pretty aggressive, not really asking questions in a neutral and supportive way, asking questions like, are you sure it happened this way? She was repeating certain questions to Taylor again and again. And then asking her, do you want to go back to foster care? And if you continue this report, these are all the things that could happen to you. So it doesn't end there. It keeps going. And she says things like, you won't get the braces that I've heard you want or need. You won't get these new shoes. Your mom's going to lose her car. Your dad's going to lose his job. So you're talking to a 12-year-old, telling them that all these horrible things will happen if they continue to make the report. And remarkably, Taylor doesn't recant. She just stops talking. But very quietly later on, she does say, and that's what you hear in the piece, that she's not lying. She's telling the truth.
Rachel, any sense of where this culture of law enforcement turning on a victim that you're describing comes from?
It's a really good question. Where does this come from? Like Taylor said, and I think this is true, everyone's different. So I'm not really sure where this came from for Melissa Turnage. That morning when she made the report, she had been disciplined. She's 12, so she was getting disciplined a lot, right? Based on the phone, which was the biggest issue of the time. So it makes no sense why that morning she would have just decided to make up something so extreme and serious. But I think that for some officers, maybe it's something they've heard that's been repeated, that people make this up. And I would have loved to ask Melissa Turnage why she thought that, but I never got the opportunity to. I think there's a lot of skepticism when it comes to people reporting sexual assault and rape because perpetrators are very good at hiding it. They're very good at doing it in a way so there's no witnesses. This is how most sexual assaults happen. It's in private, it's in the dark. And then on top of that, so they're very good at picking victims. So Henry had access to someone who, I don't know what was in his mind. I'm not going to try to imagine that, but he did have access to Taylor, who certainly, had a background that could easily be turned against her. I think the skepticism could be because of how the crime is perpetrated, because it's rarely done in a way where there can be anyone to corroborate it. Also, kids are going to, be very confused about how to talk about it. Taylor was very, very clear in her language. There's no doubt. I listened to her 2-hour forensic interview, and it was very, very detailed. So I'm not talking about Taylor in this case, but for other kids who may be younger, I think it's hard to figure out how to describe it. They may feel some kind of attachment to the person who's done this, so they don't want to get them in trouble.
Rachel, what's the takeaway from this? What should we understand about your reporting?
I hope that the takeaway is that this is a very serious thing to do to someone, to say, not only do I not believe you have evidence that there was a rape, which is one thing. It's one thing if Detective Turnage had just said, look, I'm so sorry, Taylor. We don't have enough to go forward and prosecute Henry. Here are these resources. I hope you are safe. That would have been one thing. But it is so extreme and so serious to then say to that child, you are a liar and you are a criminal, and now you're going to go to court. Because what then happens is that the next time he does this, he thinks he's going to get away with it. And he didn't, which is remarkable, but he could have. And he could have continued doing it. So I do hope the takeaway is that this is a very extreme decision for law enforcement to move forward with false reporting charges or any criminal charges against someone who comes forward as a victim, and that there should be some process, something that requires a slowdown, where someone could have reviewed Melissa Turnage's work and listened to her audio recordings and heard, wait a second, this is someone who's not questioning someone using trauma-informed methods. This is not someone who did X, Y, and Z as you should have in an investigation. So like Taylor said, as a journalist, I would just love answers. I'd love to know if the sheriff's office has done anything to change their policies or procedures, and I will welcome that response at any point.
Taylor, he wasn't able to get away with this because of your strength and your actions. I just want to know, how are you doing now?
So my life did a complete turn when I became a mother. I realized that I wasn't just living for myself anymore, that I had two tiny human beings to take care of and to raise, to teach them right from wrong, and to protect them at all costs and give them everything that I didn't have, even something as unmaterialistic as protection. My love, my protection, my care, like that's when my life turned around, was, I would say, when I became a mom.
Taylor Cadle is a survivor of sexual abuse. Rachel DeLeon is a reporter and producer with the Center for Investigative Reporting. We should add that we also reached out to the Polk County Sheriff's Office for a comment on how their procedures have changed since Taylor's case. The department respectfully declined participating. The National Sexual Assault Hotline is something that is free, confidential, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The support system is available as an online chat, or you can call them at 800-656-HOPE. Coming up, we will hear the latest installment of Central Florida Public Media's series looking at overcoming political differences. Just a reminder, if you are heading out, you can listen to Central Florida Public Media's Engage live on the radio at 90.7 FM in Greater Orlando and the Space Coast, and 89.5 FM in Ocala and the Villages. You can always stream us live at cfpublic.org or on the free Central Florida Public Media app. Just tell your smart speaker to play Central Florida Public Media. If you miss any part of our show today, you can always subscribe to the Engage podcast and listen whenever it is convenient for you. This is Engage on Central Florida Public Media. I'm Sharon Stone. You are listening to Engage here on Central Florida Public Media. The 2024 presidential election is finished. So how do we begin to come together as a country? Central Florida Public Media and StoryCorps are bringing together strangers with differing political views for a guided conversation. Let's hear from Orange County resident Julius Williams and Volusia County resident Ray Donadio.
My name is Julius Williams. I'm 79 years old.
I'm Ray Donadio, age 68.
What type of music do you like best?
Well, I play bass guitar in a little band, a 5-piece band. We do rock and roll 60s, 70s, and we play VFWs, Eagles, private parties, and it's a bunch of old guys.
I'm not a musician, but I like jazz, traditional jazz. Not the current stuff that they put on.
Yeah.
I like
improvisational jazz.
Yeah, improvisational jazz.
Irby Green, you remember that name?
Yeah.
I got to play with him once, jazz trombonist at our college.
That's what I found I like about particularly jazz. You start out together, you go out on your own way, and then you come back, go out, you come back. And it's kind of like life,
But these two things you found particularly important about your bio was the medical care and free quality public education aspects of what your beliefs are. So say a little bit more about that.
In the United States, it's probably one of the best educational systems in the world. It's free. The only problem with it is the quality. Children who live in lower class or lower income communities don't have all the benefits. And we just got to figure out a way that everyone can get a good quality education.
May I ask, was your elementary school segregated or integrated?
Segregated, both. High school, all the way from first grade right on through 12th grade.
Okay.
And as I said before, I just want a roof over my head. I want to put food on the table. and everybody else desires the same. I had a discussion several weeks ago with a very close friend over gun control. But I've known the guy for 20 years. So I'm going to not be friends simply because we don't agree on who should own guns.
Do you have any of that with family?
No.
I have that with family. This particular election season, well, the particular candidates, very divisive. And I have brothers who are on the other side of the fence. And we've discovered that we can't discuss politics. So we don't, because the relationship is more important than the politics of it. But it grieves me. And I have to struggle with not wanting to persuade them.
Well, maybe you ought to stop trying to persuade them.
Well, yes, you're right. And you know why? Because I'm not going to persuade them. Because we don't have the same worldview. I don't want two people who I don't know, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. I don't want them to dictate my relationship with my family or my friends.
Hopes for the future. One thing that, we can start talking to each other. But the other thing that I think what I would hope for is this. We live in the richest country in the world, and people shouldn't be living on the streets. And, as you drive around town here in Orange County, there's this areas where you just find that homeless people have congregated. And we have to be able to find some kind of way that everyone can have a roof over their head at night. People should have enough to eat. And that's what my hope for the future would be.
You are an enigma to me, because the things you mentioned, that and healthcare and education, are all things that when I got here are things that I wouldn't have expected from someone who was conservative. You and I, even though we're on different sides of the political spectrum, agree on those things. Now, maybe where we don't agree is should the assistance given to those homeless or those in need, should it come from the government?
Only government can do certain things. The question becomes, to what extent does government interfere with or control my life? As a conservative, I know we have to pay taxes. Okay. The question becomes, how much of my money are you going to take?
As a progressive, I guess I view social justice and acceptance and affirmation of people as part of the progressive. Now, with regard to like fiscal taxes, I pay taxes, and I'd be lying if I said I want to pay more. But on the other hand, I don't want to pay less if it's going to impinge upon the services.
There's certain things that only government can do. There's certain things that they can't do. And they shouldn't get involved in it.
Say more about that. Give me a couple of examples where government shouldn't be involved.
Here in Florida, the legislature decided that they would pass a statute against, what do they call it? Gender-affirming treatment. I have a child, I have a relationship with that child. We have a relationship with the physician. And we have made a decision that this is what is best for my child. And you're going to tell me that, no, I can't do what's best for my child because you think this is not best for my child.
That person's worldview is imposing upon your.
Stay out of that. You shouldn't have. You don't get involved in that. That's between me and my child and my doctor.
Okay? I hear you.
That's my conservative view.
I've truly enjoyed this conversation.
So have I. So I'll give you my phone number.
Yes.
And you can come along with it.
I'm joined now in the studio by Abe Aboraya. He's a producer at Central Florida Public Media. Thanks for being with us here.
Absolutely.
So, Abe, what made you put Julius and Ray together?
So the common thread for them was that they actually both have a background in the legal world. So they both were attorneys in some way, shape, or form. And so I thought that was a good sort of way to kind of get them together, and they would have a little bit of that commonality there. And this is one of those conversations that definitely surprised me, because Julius was, when I would talk to him on the phone, he was very different than when he was doing the conversation. He opened up quite a bit. So it was really, really cool to see.
So you said this surprised you. Was there a moment or two that stood out from the conversation with you?
So one of the things, I did want to play a little bit of extra tape for you guys, because, Ray Donadio did tell a really kind of interesting story talking about his background growing up. We'll go ahead and take a listen to that now.
One of my earliest experiences that helped to form my worldview is, it was 1963 and I was 8 years old, and we had just moved to a new house. But this fellow was African-American, and he went 2 doors down to the local corner dairy. It was a soda shop with a soda fountain. And that man went in there to get a Coke, and they would allow him to have a Coke if it was in a paper cup and not a glass, and they made him go outside and drink it. He wasn't allowed to sit at the counter. And I'm 8 years old, and I'm in an Italian community where we were mostly Italians. But that experience shocked me in 1963, that people could be that rude to people. Because like you said, we're all people. And I don't know, that started to I started to notice that there was a different treatment of people who looked different. And that's always been it's bothered me. The second thing I want to share is that later on in life, I discovered from my mother that she had an experience when she was a kid. The lady next door's husband died, and my grandmother made a bowl of spaghetti and brought it to the lady and offered it to her, and as a gift. And the next day, the little girl from next door was at school with my mom, and she said, "How did you like the spaghetti?" And the little girl said, my mom just took that to the kitchen and threw it away, because she told us we don't eat food that's prepared by Italians because they're dirty. And I thought, that's how it felt to be the other.
Yeah.
And that also had an impact on me. Sorry about this, but it's...
Yeah, but see, that's one of the... We have to be able to talk to each other so that we can discover that really there was nothing wrong with that bowl of food.
No.
I mean, we do it all the time. If somebody, I attend church on a regular basis. Somebody dies, we make a dish, take it over to the house.
Yeah.
And but that's a tradition. I think that is a tradition in all communities.
So let's take a look forward. How do you think these conversations are going to change now that the presidential election is behind us?
So I'm not entirely sure what the going forward is going to look like, but what I can tell you is that we did have a conversation the day after the election, and both participants showed up, which, you never know. And they sat down, had an hour and a half long conversation, give or take, and they were able to come out of that and still shake hands and talk to each other. So hopefully we'll continue that trend through the rest of the year.
Abe Aboraya is a producer at Central Florida Public Media and facilitator for One Small Step Conversations. To sign up for a conversation, visit cfpublic.org/onesmallstep. That is all for today's edition of Engage. All of our shows are available on demand at cfpublic.org. As always, we do want to hear from you. Engage with us. Let us know what you would like to hear more about, what you're glad you heard, other ideas. Send us an email, engaged@cfpublic.org. Or if you prefer, you can send us a talkback on the free Central Florida Public Media app. In the menu, just select Send Us a Talkback, record your comment or question. We'll take your feedback and just hit send and it comes right to us. And there's always old school voicemail. Give us a call, 407-273-2300. Our extension is 246. Just leave us one, we'll get that too. Again, thank you for the company. I'm Sharon Stone. All Things Considered with Nicole Darden-Creston is coming up. That is following NPR News.